My name is Linda Barrett, and for 20 years, I believed I was building a life with my husband Richard. I cooked his meals, washed his clothes, scheduled every doctor appointment, and held his hand through every hospital visit. People said I was a devoted wife. I thought so too. I thought love meant being there in sickness and in health, even when it hurt. But everything changed on a warm Thursday morning in late spring. I had woken up early, baked his favorite oatmeal muffins, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. He was recovering from a minor stroke, and I wanted him to feel a sense of normalcy. I even remembered to bring his reading glasses from the nightstand. When I arrived at the hospital, a nurse told me Richard had gone down to the courtyard for some air. I headed there, expecting to find him quietly resting. Instead, I heard his voice before I saw him. He was talking to another patient, some man from the next bed over. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I stopped cold when I heard him say, "She's nothing but a free caregiver." Honestly, I hit the jackpot. She cooks, cleans, takes care of my meds. I don't pay a dime? And the money? That's going to my son? Of course. His words hit harder than any diagnosis ever could. I stood frozen behind the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. It was like someone had cracked open the floor beneath me. Every quiet moment I had ever shared with him suddenly felt fake, rehearsed. Not love, but convenience. "She thinks we have a great relationship," he went on, chuckling. "But when I'm gone, she can go stay with her daughter. Won't be my problem." I didn't cry. Not right then. I turned away, slow and silent like a ghost, and walked back down the hallway, gripping the paper bag of muffins I had baked with care. That was the moment I knew I hadn't been protecting a marriage. I had been living in a transaction. And something inside me, something quiet and long silenced, finally woke up. When I returned home that evening, the house felt colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in spirit. The sunlight poured in through the windows like it always did in late afternoon, but it didn't warm anything. I left the lights off and just sat in the living room, still wearing my jacket, holding my keys in one hand like I wasn't sure whether I should stay. This house had never truly been mine. It was Richard's before I came along. He had shared it with his first wife. The furniture, the layout, even the wallpaper in the hallway, they all belonged to a chapter one wasn't part of. When we married, I suggested starting fresh, maybe moving to a new place together. He shook his head. "Dylan's used to this house," he said. "No need to stir things up." Dylan, his son, was already 15 when I moved in. A head taller than me, eyes full of quiet judgment. He never called me Mom. Never even said my name without a hard edge. I remember bringing my 2 small boxes of belongings into that house, one with books, the other with kitchenware. I tried so hard to make it feel like home. I once spent 3 full days scrubbing the grease-stained kitchen with lemon water and baking soda, thinking maybe if I made it sparkle, I'd be accepted. Back then, I was still working at the local library. I'd come home, grocery bags in hand, and cook the meals I knew they liked. On our first Thanksgiving together, I cooked a full dinner from scratch. Turkey, cranberry sauce, homemade stuffing. Dylan poked at the gravy and muttered, "Tastes weird. My mom's was better." I remember standing there, still holding the serving spoon, wondering why my chest ached like that. That was probably the moment I first started disappearing. A slow fade that no one noticed. Not even me. There's a strange kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from giving too much of yourself for too long without return. That was the shape of my marriage to Richard. I was there when he lost his job. I handled all the paperwork, unemployment forms, insurance appeals, mortgage renegotiations. While he mourned the title on his business card, I made sure the bills got paid. When his ex-wife passed from cancer, he sobbed on the porch for hours, clutching an old photo. I sat beside him in silence and brought him tea. He never once asked how I felt about it. When Dylan dropped out of college after only a year, Richard was devastated. I remember him pacing the kitchen floor late into the night. 2 days later, I offered to cover Dylan's credit card debt with my own retirement savings. I thought I was helping hold the family together. Looking back, I was the only one doing the holding. I tried so hard to fit into their world. I pretended to like golf, even bought a visor and a pair of white sneakers just to look the part on the weekends. I smiled at family reunions, even when Richard forgot to introduce me. At his niece's wedding, he gestured vaguely and said, "This is Linda. She's a friend of the family." I laughed, politely, and then spent the rest of the evening sitting alone in the car, biting the inside of my cheek to keep the tears from falling. That night, I still went home and made dinner. That's what it was like. Quiet erasure. Not enough to scream about, but just enough to slowly strip away your sense of place. I used to believe that marriage meant compromise. That you folded yourself a little smaller to make room for someone else's life. I told myself it was noble, even mature, to let the past be the past and focus on building something new. But over time, I wasn't building anything. I was just patching up someone else's ruins, with no blueprint of my own. And all the while, no one was patching me up. A few days after Richard was discharged from the hospital, I found myself alone in the study, sorting through the filing cabinet. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock, and the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I had planned to go through his medical paperwork, insurance statements, discharge summaries, upcoming appointments. It was something I did without thinking, just part of the routine. A ritual of care that had become second nature. Richard kept everything in color-coded folders. Blue for medical, red for bank accounts, yellow for insurance. He was meticulous that way, organized, precise, always in control. As I was flipping through the yellow folder, a single page slipped loose and floated to the floor. I bent down and picked it up. It was a life insurance policy. I had seen a version of it years ago, but this one had been updated. I skimmed down the page to the list of beneficiaries. Primary beneficiary 1, Dylan Barrett. Primary beneficiary 2, Margaret Barrett, deceased. No secondary. No mention of me, not even in fine print. My hand went cold. It wasn't about the money. I never married Richard expecting a windfall. But I had assumed naively, it seemed that after 20 years my name would at least exist on paper. That somewhere, in some quiet line or clause, there would be an acknowledgement that I had mattered. There wasn't. He had filed every detail, signed every form, arranged every possibility for after his death, but I wasn't part of any of it. Not as a wife, not as a person. I sat down slowly, the page trembling in my hand. Everything I had done, filing taxes, picking up prescriptions, staying up through his night sweat, suddenly felt like evidence in a case I didn't even know I was losing. And there it was, in plain ink. He didn't plan a future with me in it. He had built a life where I was useful, but not worthy. And now, for the first time, I began to wonder, if he saw me as disposable, why had I worked so hard to hold him together? Maybe it was time to stop. I didn't sleep that night. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I kept replaying his voice in the courtyard, the cold words on that insurance document, the invisible years of my life stacked like forgotten boxes in an attic. At sunrise, I made a cup of coffee I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. That's when I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Carolyn's Flowers, came the familiar voice, bright and warm. "Hey," I said quietly, "it's me." She paused for half a second. "Linda? Honey, are you okay?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. Carolyn didn't press. "Where are you right now?" she asked gently. "Just come. You don't need to explain." 25 minutes later, I walked into her shop, a small corner store filled with lavender stems and sunflowers. There was a handwritten chalkboard by the register that read, "Today's flower meaning, you don't owe anyone your silence." When she saw me, she wrapped her arms around me without a word. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone had noticed the ache I was carrying. She led me to the back patio where the morning light filtered through climbing roses. We sat in 2 wooden chairs. I told her everything what I had overheard, what I had found, what I had felt but never dared to say aloud. She listened. That was all. No gasps, no pity, just presence. When I finished, she looked at me and said something that hit deeper than anything Richard had ever said in 2 decades. "Linda, you weren't his wife. You were his unpaid labor. He never saw you. He used you. And you let him because you were kind. But kindness doesn't mean staying in a cage just because someone left the door open." I sat there still, and then I exhaled. Because she was right. The door had been open the whole time. I just needed to walk through it. I didn't pack with rage. I packed with clarity. That same evening, after returning home from Carolyn's flower shop, I opened the hallway closet and pulled out a small suitcase. I didn't need much, just a few sets of clothes, some personal papers, my laptop, and a single photograph of Melissa, my daughter from my first marriage. Richard was napping in the den with the TV humming in the background. He didn't hear the suitcase wheels roll across the hardwood. He didn't notice when I paused at the kitchen table and left a folded paper under the salt shaker. It was a copy of the formal separation notice, signed by me and an attorney. The next morning, I left, quietly. No scene, no drama, just a woman choosing herself. Carolyn welcomed me into the small upstairs apartment above her shop. It was barely 400 square feet, with a kitchenette and a window that looked out over the back garden, but it was mine. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, hands in my lap, breathing in the scent of lilac and lemon balm drifting in from the garden below. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and searched for something I had never typed before: freelance editing jobs for retired professionals. It felt strange, like learning to walk again. But within a week, I found a part-time position copywriting articles for a digital lifestyle platform. The first check was modest, but it was mine. No one asked me to cook in return, no one expected a favor, no one questioned my value. And for the first time in decades, I went to sleep in a space where I wasn't needed, I was simply allowed to be. That night, I made myself a simple dinner: roasted squash, a fresh green salad, a glass of wine. I didn't light a candle. I didn't set the table for two. I just sat by the window, fork in hand, and whispered softly to myself, "You're doing it, Linda. You're really doing it." A few days after settling into Carolyn's apartment, I called Melissa. She didn't ask for explanations. She just said, "Come visit me in Boston. Stay as long as you want." I flew out 2 days later with my suitcase and a quiet hope tucked deep in my chest. Melissa lived in a modest cottage with a garden she kept herself. When I arrived, she met me at the gate with a long hug. "You don't look well," she said softly. I smiled the best I could. "I'd been better," I whispered. That evening, over pumpkin soup and warm bread, I told her everything about Richard, the life insurance, the years of erasure. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, eyes burning with quiet fury. When I finished, she said, "We need to speak to a lawyer. You deserve more than a quiet exit. You deserve justice." I nodded. We met with Karen Yates, a divorce attorney in her 50s with calm eyes and a sharp mind. Her office was above a second-hand bookstore that smelled of old pages and fresh coffee. Karen reviewed my documents: the marriage certificate, joint accounts, Richard's retirement records. Then she looked up at me and said something I hadn't expected to hear. "Linda, under California law, you're entitled to a share of marital assets and spousal support. You gave 2 decades of unpaid care. That matters." I blinked. She continued, "This isn't revenge. It's your legal right." We filed the paperwork that week. Richard was served the following Monday. He called me just once. "You really want to drag this through court?" he asked, his voice brittle. "No," I said calmly. "I want what I earned." The court process was short. Richard had no real defense. Worse, during discovery we found that he had transferred a large portion of assets to Dylan the year prior. The judge didn't appreciate that. In the final ruling, I was awarded 1/3 of our marital assets, including cash compensation and investment returns, and $2,500 per month in spousal support for 2 years. It wasn't a windfall. It was a reckoning. And for the first time, I felt something return to my spine that had been missing for years. Strength. 2 weeks after the court ruling, a letter arrived from the hospital. It stated that Richard had suffered a hypertensive crisis and was now in the ICU. There were no listed next of kin available to approve long-term care. No family member had signed the necessary documentation. I sat at Carolyn's kitchen table with the letter in my hands, still as stone. Just days ago, he had walked into that courtroom in full control, head high, voice smug. But something in the verdict must have cracked his armor. Because to Richard, money wasn't just wealth, it was identity. And now, with that stripped away, so was his power. I didn't call the hospital. I didn't visit. Instead, I phoned Karen and asked her to transfer all legal care authority to Dylan. The next day, she called me back. "It's done. But Dylan's refusing to respond to the hospital. He's not cooperating." I wasn't surprised. Dylan, like his father, had only shown loyalty to opportunity. When he realized half the estate was no longer his interest vanished. That same evening, while trimming roses out back, Carolyn glanced up from her clippers and said, I saw something Dylan posted online. He wrote, "Dragging around debt and refusing to die is selfish. At least a quick death gets you insurance money." I didn't react. I just nodded. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Richard's biggest fear had never been illness. It wasn't even death. It was being forgotten. It was no longer being served. And now, with his health failing and no one showing up at his bedside, the mask had finally fallen. He gave everything to Dylan. And Dylan, he's just waiting for the paperwork to clear. No hospital calls, no bedside prayers, just numbers and timelines and whatever was left in an account. I used to think that walking away would make me heartless. But as I stood in the flower shop later that night, hands dusted with soil, watching the tulips bloom, despite the late season cold, I realized something far more true. Walking away was the most loving thing I had ever done for myself. Carolyn's upstairs apartment wasn't fancy. The walls creaked when the wind blew, and the pipes made a low groan at night. But it was quiet, peaceful, mine. There was a small west-facing window that overlooked her backyard garden. In the afternoons, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, like warm honey. I'd sit there sometimes with a cup of tea and just breathe. No one needed me, no one called my name. There was no task waiting behind every silence. That stillness at first felt like emptiness, but over time I realized it was freedom. One evening I cooked dinner just for myself. Roasted butternut squash with rosemary, a simple salad with goat cheese and walnuts, and a glass of chilled Riesling. I played an old jazz record on the portable speaker Carolyn had gifted me. The saxophone notes filled the space softly, like a conversation I didn't have to answer. It had been years since I'd cooked without an expectation attached. After dinner, I opened my laptop to check on the editing project I'd submitted. There was a message from the platform's editor. "Your notes were incredibly precise. Would you be open to taking on more regular assignments?" I smiled. Not out of pride, not to prove anything, but because the work, the quiet, focused, careful work was mine. My effort, my value, my felice. Later that night, I wrote a new blog post for the little column I had started, Rebirth Stories for Women in Their Second Act. The draft title read, "From Being Needed to Being Seen." The words came slowly, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally had so much to say my way, in my voice. I was no longer living to fill someone else's space. I was learning how to fill my own. The life I had before was about surviving. But this was the beginning of living. And it tasted nothing like silence. A few weeks later, Melissa flew in from Boston to visit. She arrived with a small paper bag in hand, grinning like a kid. "I brought your favorite brownies," she said, holding up the bag with a sticker she'd made herself. It read, "Congratulations, Mom, on being reborn." We laughed. Really laughed. The kind that fills a room and settles in the corners like sunlight. She stepped into the apartment and looked around. "Mom," she said slowly, her eyes scanning the space, "you really made this place yours." "Of course I did," I replied, pointing to a wooden plaque on the wall. Carved into it were the words, "Linda's space. Quiet. Curious. Free. Carolyn had helped me pick it out, said it captured who I was becoming. That afternoon, Melissa and I sat in the garden helping Carolyn label new flower arrangements. I chose the center shelf display and wrote on the tag, "Gratitude Rose." Melissa raised an eyebrow and teased, "Really?" I nodded. "It's a late bloomer," I said. "But it's strong. And steady." Later, over tea, Melissa pulled out a set of case studies from her office, real stories of women reclaiming their lives after long marriages. She flipped to one page and pointed to a highlighted quote. "At any age, the decision to stop being agreeable is an act of bravery. But true victory is becoming your full self without needing anyone's permission." I folded the corner of the page and whispered, "Do you remember asking me once what kind of person I wanted to be?" She smiled. "You said, someone trusted, but never taken for granted." I nodded. I think I finally understand what that means now. That night, I stood at the flower shop's front door. The string lights above twinkled softly. Laughter drifted from inside. Wind chimes clinked like glass coins in the breeze. And I stood there not as a wife, not as a caregiver, not as a placeholder, but as Linda Barrett. A woman with a name, a voice, and finally, a life of her own. To anyone watching, you are not too late. And you have never, not once, been invisible.